Hello, friends and freedom lovers. My name is Angela Harders, and I am so excited to talk with you today as we continue to dive in and expose the truth about PMAs and 508c1as. As many of you know, I was a former PMA Power advisor with David Edwards and his team at PMA Power. Unfortunately, since I became a PMA Power advisor, I have spent the last several months researching further in depth about PMAs in order to be able to create a course that would help my clients to be able to operate their PMAs properly. In the course of developing this course, I came to realize that many of the things that David Edwards and many other supposed PMA experts or 508c1a experts, a lot of the things that they were saying simply were not true. And as I brought my concerns to the PMA Power advisory team, I thought that they would be just as excited as I was to really dig into this and really discover the truth. I found out very quickly that they were not. And so after multiple attempts at trying to communicate with them and share my concerns over the things that they had been saying and the things that we had been taught that were not true, they refused to listen to me, refused to acknowledge any of my concerns. And so together with a team of 4 other PMA Power advisors, we released a document called the PMA Manifesto, which is a 26-page document that shares 12 myths about PMAs as well as 12 truths that you need to know about PMAs prior to getting one, or if you already have one, you need to get that document and you need to read through it in its entirety to make sure that you are set up properly. Now, that being said, within 1 hour of releasing my Truth About PMAs video and the PMA Manifesto, David Edwards' advisory team removed me and my 4 other teammates, removed all of us from the PMA Power website. They removed us from all of the PMA Power communications, from their chats, from their MeWe groups, from all of it. The 3 leaders of the PMA Power team are Amber Sinsala, Guy Stinson, and Dr. Layne Linebaugh. You may not be familiar with the first 2 names, but if you are researching about PMAs on YouTube, you will definitely know Dr. Layne Linebaugh. These were people that I considered to be my friends, people that I truly believed had a heart not only for freedom, but also to walk in truth, which is why it was very surprising to me at the way that they responded to the information that I was bringing to them. Recently, I logged into my YouTube and I noticed I had a notification saying that Dr. Layne Linebaugh had released a YouTube video sharing an important update. And to be honest, I was really excited when I saw that because I thought, wow, finally she has seen the light. Her eyes have been opened. She is being brave enough to admit that we were told some things that were not true, and she is finally willing to be brave enough to tell the truth. I was so excited to see that video, and to be honest, the video that she shared the update on was a video that I had actually already started kind of going through and providing a rebuttal for. And as she was going through and as I watched the video, I realized that no, unfortunately, instead of admitting the truth about PMAs, Dr. Layne just continued to dig her heels in even more, and she is continuing to spread misinformation about PMAs and 508c1as. And this is information that can absolutely cause harm to people that do not know the truth. And so it is very important that you can watch this video. Please share this video with anyone that you know that is in the freedom community so that they are able to hopefully save themselves from a lot of headache, a lot of fines potentially, and potentially even time in prison for listening to this false information. Today, I'm going to play Dr. Layne's important update that she released, and I'm going to be pausing it at different points. I'm going to be sharing my thoughts as well as different facts that you will need to know as it relates to the things that Dr. Layne is sharing about. This video is going to be extremely important for people that are interested in PMAs, but also for people that currently have a PMA, because the truth is that the same things that Dr. Layne Linebaugh is going to tell you in this video are the same things that David Edwards is sharing, as well as all the other people on the PMA Power team, and even people that are not in PMA Power but have worked with him, like Renegade Ranch, Mike Colomb, and many of these other people, pro advocates, Many people out there are just kind of repeating the same lies over and over and over. And again, I can't speak to whether or not they're doing that intentionally or not, but I will say it is important that we can know the truth so that we can then walk in truth. And that is my only intention in sharing this with you. I want you to know the truth so that you can walk in truth. And I'm here to help you and support you along the way as much as I can. All right, here we go. Let's dive in.
Hi everyone, welcome back. In this video, I am going to do my very best to untangle some of the questions here I've been getting about the difference between churches and ministries. Why are they both 508c1a tax-exempt status, and the protections that you do receive, what paperwork needs to be filed, rather not filed, and all of that good stuff. So it's not really just one question, because it's kind of the same question or different variants of questions around churches and ministries. Disclaimer, I am not a CPA, I am not an IRS agent, I am not a lawyer, I am a private membership association advisor with David Edwards' team, and I've spent a lot of time in the last few months really wrapping my mind around all of these different ins and outs between the private and the public domain. Okay, so the first thing that I want you to remember is what we're talking about here is whether it is a faith-based organization, a private health association, a ministry, or a church. We are talking about unincorporated.
Layne just offered 4 different examples of 4 different types of organizations. She said a faith-based organization, a private health association, a ministry, or a church. If you've not seen the first rebuttal video that I have made about Layne and her videos, please go back and watch that one. It was actually her video entitled, "What is a Faith-Based Organization?" And in that video, she shares her thoughts and opinions about what it means to be a faith-based organization. And I rebutted that video showing you the facts about what it really means to be a faith-based organization. And as we see with Dr. Layne, as well as many of these other people that are perpetrating these fake and false narratives about PMAs, they're going to do this same thing over and over and over and over again. They're going to try to make all these different types of entities, try to combine them all into one big mumbo jumbo mess, and we just can't do that. But one thing that she was correct on is the fact that she said that all these different types of organizations, we're all talking about them through the framework of an organization or an association that is unincorporated. And this is something really important as well. If you have not yet seen my updated Introduction to PMAs video, you'll see that I go in depth about what that exactly means. So basically, the term PMA does not actually exist. It's not a legal term. It is not a term that you will find in any legal or financial literature, but the term that you will see is the term unincorporated association. So PMA is basically a fancy term for an unincorporated association. All right, let's keep listening.
This took me a long time to keep remembering, is that, oh, right, the status that we are talking about is unincorporated. So that right there answers a lot of the questions. It immediately takes us into a different realm than the corporated ministries or churches or public entities. It might be fun for you to think of it this way. As one of my favorite podcasters says, these are corporations. So while people, as we're watching, are walking around zombie-like, or they've been taxed to death, the rules of the corporation are making people not live. So maybe that'll help.
I appreciate the fact that Dr. Layne is emphasizing the fact that she is referring to unincorporated entities. However, she doesn't really go into depth about the pros and cons of both, because the reality is There are pros to becoming incorporated. There are pros and cons to any type of business structure. And so it really is important that you can have someone who is impartial enough to be able to adequately advise you as to the pros and cons of both. If you're curious about the pros and cons of being unincorporated versus incorporated, I invite you to check out my Introduction to PMAs video, linked below in the description.
So we're talking about an unincorporated entity. And then the other thing is you're probably not going to be setting up a church.
She's right. You probably aren't going to be setting up a church. And that's the problem, because she's trying to convince everyone to be a 508c1a without telling them that a 508c1a is a church. So if you're not going to be setting up a church, then you're also not going to be setting up a 508c1a.
Update number 1. So you might set up a church, and you might not be setting up a church. However, I want you to remember that our First Amendment right, our First Amendment freedom says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Important to the conversation here is Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting our free speech. This means they don't get to define what we are calling a church.
This is partially correct. The IRS doesn't define what a church is. However, they do have a 14-point criteria that they will use in order to determine if an organization is operating as a bona fide church. Let's take a look at those now. If you would like to see this list for yourself, go ahead and look at the link in the description, or you can just Google IRS churches defined. The IRS defines a church by these 14-point criteria: distinct legal existence, a recognized creed and form of worship, definite and distinct ecclesiastical government, a formal code of doctrine and discipline, distinct religious history, membership not associated with any other church or denomination, an organization of ordained ministers selected after completing prescribed courses of study, literature of its own, established places of worship, regular congregations, regular religious services, Sunday schools for the religious instruction of the young, and schools for the preparation of its members. Now, keep in mind, a church does not have to have all 14 of these, but there are definitely certain aspects of this 14-point criteria that are must-haves if you're going to qualify as an actual bona fide legitimate church. If you would like to learn more about the criteria that are absolutely essential in order to qualify as a legitimate bona fide church, I invite you to download and read the PMA Manifesto at thepmamanifesto.com.
There's no substantive evil. Private is private. And so you may or may not have a church according to how we think church usually looks like, with these regular services and a sermon at an established time. That is part of the IRS's definition of church. And we actually probably fall under some of those definitions, and you don't have to match up, but it's just nice. You say, okay, well, falling under that, but it doesn't really matter.
It doesn't really matter if you're operating with integrity as a bona fide church or just falsely claiming to be one. Yikes.
Now, the next part of that is, in the Bible, the word church always refers to the body of believers who have given their lives to the Lord, and not to a building in which they may be gathered from time to time. And this also falls under the consideration that if you and I are walking alone in the hills or down the street, I'm still part of the church. I am the church, and I actually really get to define that. So whether or not you are establishing a more formal church, maybe you do have a church building or not, Congress still doesn't get to define that, and in turn, neither does the IRS.
I agree with Layne. I think it's important for us as the true church, the body of Christ, to remember that the church is not the building, the church is the body. We are the church. I truly believe that this is something that God is calling his people to remember. The fact that we are meant to be the church. The church is not the building, the church is us. And so I'm grateful that Layne pointed that out. However, even though the IRS does not define what a church is, they do have that 14-point criteria that I mentioned before.
Churches have inadvertently put themselves back into the public domain by becoming the 501c3, and that is a nonprofit, even though it's tax exempt. So we're not nonprofit.
What? You can't be tax exempt and not be nonprofit.
Okay, so some of the links here that were sent to me, one of the questions was this article that was linked was religious nonprofits that are not churches are also required to annually file a Form 990. We don't have to file any forms with a 508c1a.
Layne is correct. A 508c1a does not have to fill out any forms. They don't have to notify the IRS annually. But as I've shown in multiple of my videos before, a 508c1a only applies to actual bona fide legitimate churches. So if you are operating a faith-based organization or a faith-based ministry, you are required to request tax-exempt status and you are required to file a Form 990.
Tax-exempt, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, how that just immediately says, we're not giving you our records. It's outside of your jurisdiction. So there is no Form 990, and again, because we're not a non-profit.
Layne is going to get herself into major hot water with this one. She's repeatedly saying over and over, we are not a non-profit. If you're not a non-profit, then that means that you are operating as a for-profit entity. And if you're operating as a for-profit entity, the IRS is going to want to come after you for taxes.
Link this as well. This article, this document the title is 508c1a free church versus the 501c3 state church. And I'm even going to just say that we're a 508c1a faith-based organization or ministry.
Notice that Dr. Layne refuses to call herself a church. Instead, she emphasizes over and over that they are a faith-based organization. Now, keep in mind, a faith-based organization is not a 508c1a. And if you want to learn more about that, check out my first rebuttal video that I did for Dr. Layne, answering her question, what is a faith-based organization?
These churches are, the church has a set congregation and a regular meeting time or space. So your ministry is not going to be holding services and having these set meeting times or place for these services, for sermons. Like, I went to church this morning. That's different than the ministry that you might be thinking about having, or a private health association like I have. Yes, I see clients on a regular time, but I'm not giving them services, also all the sermons, although some of them might think that.
Once again, Dr. Layne emphasizes that a ministry operates different than a church, and in that she is correct. But where she goes very wrong is telling people that their faith-based ministry is automatically tax exempt or that their faith-based ministry could be a 508c1a. You just can't.
So there's that distinction as well. Okay, back to this document. The section 508 states that churches or our unincorporated ministry or faith-based organization.
Why does she do that? She's reading the IRS code, section 508C1A, and reads what it says churches, and then she proceeds to add in a bunch of things that it doesn't say, things she wishes it would say, like faith-based ministry or unincorporated associations. Unfortunately, faith-based ministries and unincorporated associations are not in section 508C1A. Only churches, their integrated auxiliaries, or associations of churches
are a mandatory exception to the section 501c13. They're all
Yay, update number 2. Let's talk about mandatory in the context of these statutes. Mandatory, adjective containing a command, preceptive, imperative, and preemptory. A mandatory provision in the statute, 508C1A, is 1, the omission to follow, which renders the proceedings to which it relates void, while a directory provision is 1, the observance of which is not necessary to validity of the proceeding. And that's case law Schledsang versus May. So the mandatory part of a writ is that which commands the person to do the act specified, State versus Barnell and Williams versus Sherwood. It is also said that when the provision of a statute is the essence of the thing required to be done, it is mandatory. Kavanaugh versus Fash. Otherwise, when it relates to form and manner and where an act is incident or after jurisdiction acquired, it is directory merely. Mandatory statutory provision is one which must be observed, I'm going to say it again, must be observed, as distinguished from the directory provision, which leaves it optional with department or officer to which address to obey it or not. And that is State Dworkin versus Court of Common Pleas of Cuyahoga County. So remember, we have mandatory, and next we have exception. The act of accepting or excluding from a number designated or from a description that which is accepted or separated from others in a general rule or description, a person, thing, or case specified as distinct or not included, an act of accepting, omitting from mention, or leaving out of considering. And accept means not including. So really it was never there to begin with. And this was the case re Kelly's estate. In the next slide, we'll put all of this together with our conversation. Okay, so this is where stuff gets really exciting and a little bit of history. You may have heard some of this in some of my other videos or in your own research. But when the 501c3 was created and nonprofits and religious organizations and charities were required or they asked permission to become recognized, and then they need to do all the filing and the reporting. And part of that, of course, is banking. Well, then organizations or religious associations and people, faith-based people with firmly held spiritual belief systems, they were disenfranchised because they were no longer able to do banking the American way. So this statute, the 508c1A, was created so that people of different faiths and spiritual belief systems weren't disenfranchised, so that they could do banking. This is one of the reasons there's that box that's checked on the SS4 form that says for banking purposes only.
This is not true. First of all, 508c1A has nothing to do with banking. The mandatory exception applies to churches' requirement to file and notify the Secretary of State that they are applying or requesting permission to be tax exempt through 501c3. Churches don't have to do that. That is what the mandatory exception was for. You don't have to notify the Secretary of State, and you don't have to apply for 501c3 status as a church in order to be tax exempt. Nothing about 508c1a has to do with banking. And also, she's not even showing 508c1a here. She's showing 6033, which says the same thing, but it's not 508c1a.
And we use that with 508c1a. So it's the best we've got right now. And this is under Title 26 and 6033. Of course, I will link this. But we just talked about mandatory exceptions, right? So if you look down, you'll be able to find this with the link. But if you'll look down and we see exceptions from filing, which also means exception from responsibility, tax responsibility. I'm going to get to that in another slide further along in the video. But here we are, mandatory exceptions.
Once again, we see Dr. Layne adding her own opinions to the code. And unfortunately, we can't just do that. Section 6033 says that churches have a mandatory exception from filing. That means that they're not required to file the annual 990 form that other tax-exempt organizations are required to file. Unfortunately, Dr. Layne added to that and stated that not only are they exempt from filing, but they're also exempt from all tax obligations. And that is just flat out not true. Churches still do have tax obligations, including employment taxes, Social Security taxes that they have to pay, and unrelated business income that they will have to report and pay taxes on. Now, again, my personal belief on taxes is that none of us should have to pay any taxes at all. I think that all taxes should be voluntary. But nevertheless, this is what the code states. And if you try to think that you can avoid that, there are, again, many people that do and that try to avoid taxes, or they're tax protesters. However, by and large, that does not end well for people. They end up being charged with tax evasion or tax fraud, and they end up having to pay hefty fines, and sometimes they even end up in prison.
Paragraph 1, so that's above, shall not apply to churches, their integrated auxiliaries, and conventions or associations of churches, any organization other than a private foundation as defined in section 509A, described in subparagraph C. And then number 3, the exclusively religious activities of any religious order. So we could go under 1 and 3 most easily, depending on how you have your private association, your ministerial association, your faith-based association set up. But this is our mandatory exception, and we're not mixing any public and private laws and public and private statutes here.
This was something that I never understood from people that claim to support 508c1a. They try to say that they are not under the statutory laws, and yet here they are quoting the statutory laws as the defense for their freedom and their liberty. It makes no sense.
We are staying solid and strong in our religious liberty, our freedoms, our private is private, and able to do banking or complete banking as an American association.
And once again, private is private. She says that multiple times in several of her videos, and yet she does not understand what it legally means to be private. If you want to know, check out my Introduction to PMAs video linked in the description below.
Without notifying or applying to the government under that section 501c3. When you get your EIN number for your bank, we are telling them, we're just saying, I just removed myself. There is no writing a letter, and there's a little bit more on that here at the end. We do not have to lose our voice in this. So Section 508, special rules with respect to Section 501c3 organizations, and we have the mandatory exception. Third page, again, I'll link this. according to IRS publication 557, tax-exempt status.
And another update. So it turns out that I spent a little time on the phone with the IRS, in particular in the nonprofit department. So this is a transcript of the conversation. I'm going to paraphrase a bit and not just read this all to you. So, but I said, for context, I'm looking at the website, and at 26 U.S. C6033 returns by exempt organizations. I want to be clear about our understanding of exempt organizations and mandatory exceptions. So my first question, when an organization or association is accepted from filing, does accept from filing mean the same thing as accepted from liability, meaning tax liability?
When she asked if an organization that is accepted from filing also means that they are accepted from liability, and then she proceeds to clarify that, saying she's referring to tax liability. One, it's not a very clear question because liability can mean a wide variety of things, and perhaps the agent didn't understand that she was referring to tax liability and not other types of liability. Let's keep going.
She says if your organization is operating or has approved application, you could be accepted from having to submit your annual return. If you don't meet the exception, then you're required to submit those annual return, or it can be revoked. And then I say, right. It lists under 6033 the organizations that are required to file, and then we have the mandatory exceptions from filing, churches, discretionary exceptions, and certain organizations. She wants to ask about my EIN. I tell her I'm doing some research, and we're just wanting to be really clear if we're accepted from both filing and tax responsibility. They're getting EIN numbers under tax code 508 C1A, which in our understanding is created for religious organizations and associations for banking purposes only.
Notice she used the phrase religious organizations. And if you remember, as we read in publication 1828, the IRS makes a clear distinction between religious organizations and churches. It is only churches that have the exceptions, not religious organizations.
She asks, are they churches? And I say, yeah, they're churches, ministries, faith-based organizations.
Again, we see Dr. Layne trying to lump all three of these things into one big conglomeration: churches, ministries, and faith-based organizations. And the truth is they are three separate things.
And she says for churches, this is under 501c3. That's what they're referring to. And that's those exceptions. When we say churches, we're talking about 501c3 type organizations. Are they operating under 501 or under this 508? See, she doesn't really know. And I say, yep, they're under 508. The understanding is that churches have always been allowed to have mandatory exception. A lot of them choose to go ahead and do the exemption under 501c3. Then in 1969, the government had to create a statute for people that said, no, I don't want to do the 501c3. I don't want to become beholden to the state. I don't want to register with the state, but I still enjoy this mandatory exception. So they had to create tax code 508C1A so that these religious organizations weren't disenfranchised, so that they can do banking. And she says, well, churches are required to operate under 501c3. And I say, yeah, but they don't have to.
Again, Dr. Layne refuses to acknowledge the very clear distinction that the IRS makes between churches and religious organizations. And if there's something else important to note here, it is the fact that that IRS agent does not know what she's talking about. The fact that she said that it is mandatory, it's required for churches to operate under 501c3 when they clearly don't, just shows that even IRS agents are not adequately trained in what the law actually says.
She says, well, okay, you don't have to. The information referred to in publication 557 is referring to 501c3 type church. And I say, correct. And we're back to the difference between exemption and exception and filing and liability. Let's say church or other religious entity, because Congress shall make no law regarding religious, say they're using that code for banking purposes only, and they have not submitted an application to become a 501c3 church. Do they have a tax liability because they're mandatory accepted? Sorry, you guys. She says she can't speak about 508c1a because that's not a topic she can discuss. She can talk about 501c3 because that's the one they're showing. They're required, a church is required to be under. We have the information for 501c3. We have no one trained on the topic of 508c1a because they think the churches are required to be 501c3.
This is shocking, although I probably shouldn't be shocked. The fact that the IRS refuses to train its agents on the IRS codes. It's so bizarre.
And I said, so basically, it's just because you have it under a mandatory exception that the code was created for banking purposes only, so that these churches weren't disenfranchised or these religious people weren't disenfranchised and still could do business the American way, and you don't have any training on it. Is that right?
The mandatory exception has nothing to do with banking purposes. It has nothing to do with disenfranchised religious people wanting to do business the American way. Nothing about any of those codes, 508c1a or 6033, none of that has to do with banking or doing business. It has to do with a church being automatically tax exempt and being exempted from the obligation to apply for tax exempt status under 501c3 and being exempted from the requirement to file a Form 990. That's it.
She doesn't really answer my question, but she says, I'm saying if you're looking at publication 557 exception, it's referring to a 501c3 type church. Period. Done. End of story. Publication 557 is only for 501c3 type churches.
In the description below, I'm going to include a link to publication 557, which you can read for yourself. And if Dr. Layne had taken the time to read the publication herself, she would also see very clearly that it says exceptions from the filing requirement, the requirement to file the Form 990, which is the annual information return. She would see that it says that churches, their integrated auxiliaries, and conventions or associations of churches have an exception from the filing requirement, which means that churches are not required to file the annual 990 form. If we look further down in publication 557, we also see what the IRS states regarding FICA tax exemption. So churches are required to pay FICA taxes, but churches and qualified church-controlled organizations can elect exemption from employer FICA taxes by filing Form 8274. And further down in publication 557, we see the reference to the Form 990T. It says, although churches aren't required to file Form 1023, which is the request for tax-exempt status, or Form 990, which is that annual return with the IRS, it says they must file the Form 990T with the IRS to report unrelated business taxable income. Thus, churches must disclose Form 990T to the public. Also in publication 557, we see some organizations are not required to file the Form 1023. That's the request for tax-exempt status to become a 501c3. These organizations include churches, interchurch organizations of local units of a church, conventions or associations of churches, or integrated auxiliaries of a church, such as men's or women's organizations, religious schools, mission societies, or youth groups, or any organization other than a private foundation, normally having annual gross receipts of not more than $5,000. So if you are operating a ministry and your annual gross receipts are less than $5,000, then you don't have to request tax-exempt status. You don't have to fill out the Form 1023 to become a 501c3 in order to receive your tax-exempt status or recognition of your tax-exempt status. Notice, though, it also says these organizations are exempt automatically if they meet the requirements of Section 501c3. Shocking.
For your organization. Churches, faith-based organization. Although a church, its integrated auxiliaries, or a convention or association is not required to file the form, this one is 1023, to be exempt from federal income tax or to receive tax-deductible contributions. The organization may find it advantageous to obtain recognition of exemption. However, as shown in the examples above and the IRS code itself, a church does not have to apply or notify the government, state or federal, of its tax-exempt status. We are already established as a separate creature from the state. We need to remain separated from the state and not join in any type of partnership that would create a yoke between your religious or your faith-based organization and government, no matter what benefits they may mislead us to believe are available. Okay.
I hope that you found this video to be helpful. If you have other videos about PMAs that you would like for me to do a similar rebuttal to, please feel free to send them to me. I am more than happy to watch the video and then share my response. I also invite you to look through the other videos that I have posted on this topic on my YouTube channel. If you have not done so yet, please read and download the PMA Manifesto. That is a 26-page document of all of the research that I've conducted regarding the 12 myths about PMAs and 508c1as, and the truth that you need to know if you're going to start one or if you're going to operate one. And if you're interested in seeing if you would qualify for a PMA or a 508c1a, I invite you to book a consultation with me. Or if you have a PMA and would like for me to read over your founding documents and do a document review for you, I'm also more than happy to do that for you as well. Because the truth is, if you have formed your PMA over the last several years, the odds are it does not have the protection that you think that it has. Unfortunately, many of us have been fed misinformation, exactly like the misinformation that I showed you in this video today by Dr. Layne. It is everywhere out there, and so it's really important that we can have accurate information so that we can have true informed consent. I would love to meet with you in order to be able to talk with you about your plans and your ideas and brainstorm together the best structure that you would need to set up in order for your organization to operate in the way that will best meet your unique individual needs. So please pick a day and a time that works best for you via the link below in the description. I am so looking forward to connecting with you and figuring out which type of PMA or which structure for your organization is going to be the best fit for you. Have a great day.